All right, good afternoon, class. It's time to go ahead and to start looking at the chapter 4 homework. This homework's a little longer than some of the previous week's homework because it contains a little bit of English grammar review. We talked some about that in class on Saturday, which I guess today when I'm recording this video. And you'll be pleased to know that your suffering in English grammar will continue. But it's important, I will say, that you understand a lot of the concepts that are contained in this chapter because you're going to see them throughout the rest of your time with Greek. The upside to that is that if you don't get it the first time round, though, you'll have plenty of additional chances to understand it. But the more you can do in advance, the easier your life will be. So let's take a look at some of this stuff. The A section is something you've kind of come to expect by now, that you'll be memorizing the present active indicative paradigm of a me. And there is a memory song that Dr. Plummer uses. I do not recall if it'll be in the lecture video. I'll try and see if I can track it down on Daily Dose of Greek. But the AME paradigm, which is a little shorter than some of the other memory paradigms, which is kind of nice, like than the declension paradigms that you've been dealing with. Now we have another matching activity here where you're just familiarizing yourself with some terminology just from English with pronouns. So first one is, which one of these is a second person plural, right? You, plural, or y'all, which I kind of like doing it that way. First person singular, that's I. Third person plural, they. First person plural, we. Second person singular, you. Third person singular, he, she, or it. So that's pretty straightforward. Here it gets a little more complicated. Identify the highlighted verbs in the following sentences as active, middle, or passive. Middle voice will be nearly impossible to detect in English translation alone. So verbal forms that are middle in Greek have an asterisk. We talked a little bit about this in class, right? And I was kind of like, well, it's really difficult to describe a middle in English. And so I chose to use reflexive as an example of something distinct. But generally speaking, a middle, and Plummer will clarify this too, a middle really is something different in Greek than what English has. So here we have our first sentence, right? Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, gave it to his disciples. Well, that's a clear example of active, right? Jesus is the subject of the sentence. These verbs all describe things that Jesus is doing, right? So this is a very clear example of active. Now here, it'd be interesting, right? For he chose us for himself in him. Now, the asterisk and the fact that this is not a clear example of a passive is a dead giveaway. This is a real middle, right? This is an actual middle. There's a certain kind of personal investment that the subject has in an actual middle construction. And so God's choosing of us for himself, see, that's provided in brackets here, right? It's not merely that he chose, there's a personal element to that choosing right there. 3, now the Son of Man is glorified and God is glorified in him. Well, here we have a very clear passive, right? Something is happening to the subjects being predicated. The Son of Man is glorified, right? So that's a very clear passive. For they don't wash their hands when they eat. Well, we see the subject is the one doing the washing. We have the asterisk to indicate this is in fact a middle, which makes sense. You're washing your hands, right? Think about the action involved. You're actually doing that to yourself, right? But it's not truly a reflexive because it's your hands. Like if your hands were washing themselves, that would be a reflexive. But in this case, we have an actual middle here. John came baptizing in the wilderness and proclaiming a baptism of repentance. This is an active, right? John is the one performing the action of baptizing and proclaiming a baptism of repentance. So then, I ask you not to be discouraged. See, we have that asterisk here once again. So there's a personal involvement. We've got ourselves a middle. And with these ones, you can kind of ask yourself, like, does this work as a passive? Would be a great way when you see this particular asterisk here. And it's a decent rule to ask even in Greek of like, does this make sense as a passive, right? Like you have a subject and you have an object. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for it to be a passive. So it's a middle. Long ago, God spoke. Well, right away, we don't even need to see the rest of this, right? We know right here, God spoke. We have our subject, an active verb. It's an active. Knowing that whatever good each one does, he will receive this back from the Lord. Ooh, that's interesting, right? That's interesting. Is that a middle? Is that a passive, right? The receiving of something. Well, he, right, the good that he does, he receives, right? So he's the one, this is a middle, right? It's a middle, not a passive. Because if it was a passive, he would be received, right? Because he, our pronoun, is our subject. This is the object, right? That's the object. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized. Ooh, right? Jesus is the subject right here, and he's being acted on by baptism. So that is a passive construction. And now, we have a little section here in D, kind of asking you about aspect. We talked a little bit about this in class. It definitely didn't get the treatment it deserves, but Dr. Plummer is going to explain more about that in detail to you. And so, aspect, indicate whether the descriptions below best describe imperfective, perfective, or stative aspect. First answer, the author depicts the action as complete or as a whole. Well, that's easy. Perfective right there. Remember, perfective should not be confused with the Greek perfect, which you'll learn more about later. Perfective really is just describing a completed action. It's done. The author depicts a state of affairs resulting from a previous action or state. Now, the fact that state occurs in the sentence twice is kind of a giveaway, right? We're looking at a state of an action takes place and creates a new state. And that's our stative, right? That's our stative aspect. The author depicts an action as in process. Well, we've seen two other descriptions, right? So you kind of know by default this must be imperfective, but that's basically what an imperfective is, an action that is in process. All right, now let's talk about what tenses it corresponds to. One of these I actually already gave away the answer, and thankfully one actually does correspond to it. So we have our first one here. Question 4 is represented by the present or imperfect tense form. That's going to be our imperfective aspect. It's kind of nice that imperfective and imperfect kind of go together. And generally in a lot of languages, present tense actions are imperfective in aspect. This is true oftentimes in Hebrew and in other languages as well. It's not true across the board, but generally it's pretty typical. And so we know this is our imperfective. Is represented by the aorist tense form. That's going to be perfective. That's going to be perfective in this case. That's what the aorist corresponds to. And again, don't worry, you're going to learn a lot more about the aorist in the weeks to come. And now we have 6 is represented by the perfect or pluperfect tense form. That's going to be stative, right? I mentioned that earlier when I said that perfective should not be confused with the Greek perfect, right? So the Greek perfect corresponds to stative aspect, and pluperfect is just a very kind of deep past tense perfect. And you'll learn about that later. All right, now I've got some translations here, and there's a whole lot of them here in Greek. And you guys are going to be really getting into actual sentences to translate, which is really cool. I'm really happy for you guys to finally get into the New Testament. And you're going to get some freebies here. As you can see, Plummer has given some stuff away. Got to have more coffee. And so I'm just going to walk through the translations of these. The answer key will have some of it too. But let's talk about our first example from John 6:48. I am the bread of life. We have eimi ha'artos, tes zoes. And then as I am the bread of life. And so we know, like we've got artos here supplied, but we know it's a second declension, masculine noun, nominative singular, artos. So we know this is our subject, tes zoes. We know this is a genitive, right? And we remember zoe is the word life, right? We've got an article and we've got a feminine eta pattern genitive here, and we know it's modifying bread. So tes zoe, so artos, tes zoes, the bread of life. So if you took the eimi out, this would just be the bread of life. We have eimi, and one of the things we learned in this chapter is that verbs don't have to have an independent pronoun like in English, right? Eimi means I am, right? Just by itself. So you could write in, if you wanted to, right? Or just I, just for your subject, right? You can kind of, oftentimes when there's an implied subject in Greek, the people indicate in books with like an X right here, just a convention to be aware of. But I am the bread of life right here. And what's interesting, what you might find really interesting, is you have this first person noun or a verb, right? With first person pronominal kind of idea built into it. You don't have the explicit subject, and then you have a nominative here, right? And a lot of times the verb, based on what you've learned so far, you would probably be expecting, something like an accusative, perhaps. You would be expecting there to be an object. But this is a copulative verb, a to be verb. And well, typically when you're predicating something about the subject, right, which the subject would be in the nominative case, like you would expect, it's not unusual for the predicate with a to be verb to actually be in the nominative. That's very normal. And it's not just unique to Greek. You'll see that in other languages too. German does this, for example. All right. Our second one here, we have Basileus, which we know is king, nominative. Yisra or Israel, genitive. Estin. So this is interesting, right? Let's talk. This is generally a good principle too, right? When you come into a sentence and you don't necessarily know how to read it, a good thing to do is to come straight to the verb. To come straight to the verb and to parse it and to ask, what is it? Because it's going to tell you a lot about what's going on in a sentence just by knowing what the verb is. And in this case, we have Amy, Estine, Esmen, Este, Isine, right? That's our full paradigm for Amy. And so we know this is a third person singular verb, right? So this could be, as far as implied subjects go, we have king of Israel. Now, it wouldn't make sense to be king is of Israel. That would be kind of weird, right? Remember, we just talked about how sometimes the predicate with one of these is in the nominative, right? And it's pretty clear because Israel is right next to Basileus, and it's in the genitive, right? We expect these to be modifying terms. So king of Israel is. Well, is what? Well, there's no predicate over here. So perhaps we have the exact same scenario we do over here, right? This could be he, she, or it. In this particular case, we have king, nominative, not queen. So we know this is going to be he. He is king of Israel. He is king of Israel, right? Okay, we've got another one. Look, Dr. Plummer is kind of doing a common thing here, right? We have naos, temple of Thau, right? Temple of God. Temple of God. And now we have esmen. Remember, what's our paradigm, right? We come straight for our verb, right? Amy, A-S-T, Estine, right? Because that's a movable nu. You learned in the textbook. Esmen, este, Isine. Oh, esmen, right? We got our first person plural. We. Well, we don't have a plural subject, naos, right? This is singular, nominative, right? With this genitive here, temple of God. And we know this is a plural. So what is it? We are a temple of God, the temple of God. You can kind of see where even though there isn't an article here, you can kind of there is something of a definite idea, right? And sometimes grammarians will distinguish between what they call markedness and unmarkedness and that sort of things, because it's kind of, you can almost think of definiteness like a sliding scale, but that's a story for another time. In this particular case, just know, right, you kind of feel that pull when you're translating it to wanting to put the word the there, and I don't think that that's totally legitimate. Okay, now this is interesting, right? Once again, we zero in our verb Amy. Well, we know this is the first person singular, right? Present first person singular. Huios tu thau, son of God, right? Son of God. Once again, if we say I am, or it's like son, yeah, like there's no way for this would have to be dialogue, right? For this to be the subject of this. We were kind of familiar by now, right? We see this expected nominative predicate. I am son of God, right? And again, feel that that pull, right? That pull towards the right there. Amy, haharos kai he aletheia kai he zoe. John 14:6. I mean, if you know the truth, the life, the way, kai, your brain probably has already automatically translated this. I am, right? We see right here, the way and the truth and the life. And notice too, by the way, we don't have to repeat a me. I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. It's just I am these things, right? So you don't have to repeat that, just like in English, right? So straightforward enough there. And we have another one. And I'm betting you're probably starting to get into the rhythm by now once you've gotten here. But remember, a really helpful rule when you're dealing with these sentences, I said this before, and I'll kind of make it more explicit now. A great place to start is understand your verb, parse your verb, and work your way out from there. Esteem, right? We know we have a third person singular, Amy a estin, esmen estai seen. So we have our third person singular, could be he, she, or it as a subject. And let's come back here and think of, this is a really interesting example. And I think it's great that you guys are getting one of these so soon. Ha theos agape. Well, what do we know about agape here? Right? We have ha theos. We know this is a masculine nominative singular. We don't have an article here, but notice this ending. This is a feminine nominative singular without an article. Very intriguing, right? So it's not a genitive or a dative. And you guys haven't learned about some of the other usages of nouns yet. And so we are looking at this and we're asking, what's the relationship of agape to theos in this sentence? Well, remember, our typical predicates, right, when we're using this word, are typically nominatives, aren't they? Right? We see this here. I am huios tu theou, neos theou, right? We have that nominative predicate of our verb here. And so what we have here now is an interesting scenario where now we have ha theos and we have agape. They're both nominatives. We know they're not modifying each other. And they're both in the subject case. And we have this verb here, estin. One of the questions you might be wondering is, which one of these is actually the subject of the sentence? And we have multiple nominatives, right? Before, our verb has had the information encoded in it. So we've been able to predicate these things on that. But here we have two candidates for the subject of the sentence. And so we have to kind of ask ourselves, what would make sense? So one thing you could do, you could plug in, and we also know too that, right, that a predicate here with the copulative verb will often be nominative. So we can plug one in. What if we said ha theos is our subject? God is love. Well, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And you're probably like, I know that verse from First John. I know that's right. Okay, but bear with me. What if you put love is God in there? Would that make sense? Well, theologically, we would recognize that's not right. We know the Bible doesn't clearly teach that. God is more than love. He is love, but he's more than love. And love isn't a God, right? God is God, and love is something that describes God. But generally speaking, one of the things that gives away that this is our subject and this is our predicate is actually the presence of this definite article here. This article tells us, right? There are rules by a guy named McGaughey, remind me to talk about this sometime later in the semester, that are helpful for distinguishing when you're in these constructions, what is the subject. So in this case, we have this. Another thing too that's also helpful is often on occasion, you have the subject coming first. It's not unusual, but it's not necessarily a reliable guide because in Greek, the word order is flexible. And you might think back to John chapter 1, where now you probably could make a little more sense than you used to be able to. John chapter 1, verse 1. And sometimes the subject follows the verb. And so the article is usually the dead giveaway. Sometimes if you see a pronoun here or a proper name, those are usually fair indicators that those are your subject, right? Just kind of think about it like, if this said he, right? He is love. If it's love is he, would be grammatically incorrect, but he is love. That makes way more sense. Okay, we have another one here. Line 7, Amy ta alpha kai ta omega. Kind of wonder why John didn't write the rest of that out. It's kind of interesting to me. Amy ta alpha kai ta omega. Well, again, let's go straight for our verb, right? We know we have a first person singular, present active, Amy. And then we have two neuter words here, right? And so we know we have an implicit subject, right? I am the alpha and the omega. Straightforward enough, right? He's basically saying I'm the beginning and the end. Huios anthropou estin. We've seen similar constructions to this already, right? We have a verb. We have a present active third person singular, estin. And so we know it's he, she, or it is our subject. It could be, huios could be the subject. Son is of man. Well, that doesn't quite work, right? Because we know these predicates are typically in the nominative for estin. So we also have the genitive modifying here, son of man is. So the man is what? Well, we don't have a predicate over here. So we know this is probably our predicate. He is the Son of Man. He is the Son of Man. Okay. Esmen tekna thau. Well, we know we've got our verb here, right? We'll go straight for it. Let's parse it. It's a first person plural, present active from a me. So we know we are. That's what this is. And we don't see anything else here. That's a qualifying subject. And we've got some other words here. We've got tekna. We've got our neuter plural nominative, right? Because remember, our predicates of our copulative verbs are almost always, and by almost always, I mean, I'm pretty sure it is always, just about with these forms, but I'll say almost always because I haven't had enough caffeine today. But we are children of God, right? We know the genitive here is modifying tekna. We are children of God. Estin ha Christos. Notice this note, right? Take it in. This is a question mark. Estin ha Christos? Let's think about this for a minute. Let's start with our verb, right? We'll come back to this. We'll talk about this question sentence in a minute. Let's talk about this verb first, right? We have a present active third person singular. Amy a estin, esmen este I seen. So, estin, oh, don't want to do that. We have subject here baked into the verb, right? Because if we just said, the Christ is, question mark, wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense. But if we said, he is the Christ, and then maybe to bring this question out a little bit, right? Because he, she, or it could be the subject. We know obviously Christos is masculine. We're expecting he, right? Of course, we're talking about Jesus in John 7:26. We know he is the Christ. If we took the question mark out, that's what it would say. We had the question is, he is the Christ, and maybe smoothed over into better English. Is he the Christ? Is he the Messiah? There you have it. There you have it. A good rule that Dr. Plummer gave me in class when you're dealing with a question sentence is sometimes it can be very helpful to just translate the sentence in the indicative first. Ignore the question mark, right? Just translate it like you would any other sentence, pretend this doesn't exist. And then once you have it on the board in English, ask yourself, okay, how is this a question? What is the nature of this question? Okay, we do have these down here. I will say these are for extra credit on your quiz. If you indicate to me, and I will mention this in class, that you have done the English to Greek, I will grant to you an additional point on your homework. The church is the temple of God. The words of truth are of the Lord. The heart of man is sin. Heaven and earth are the glory of Jesus. The sign of the kingdom is the gospel. So the church is the temple of God. He ecclesia estin. What's the rest of it, right? Well, we know whatever it is going to end with tuthau, don't we? We know tahieron could be it. I think naos can also be temple, so I'll take either one. I mean, really, you're not being graded on how well you did on these, just that you did them. The words of truth are of the Lord. So halagoi teseletheos asin tuthau. Predicates aren't always that way, right? So we have here the heart of man is sin. The heart of man is sin. Think about that just for a moment. The heart of man is sin. What do you think? Right? What is the correct? We have he cardia to anthropu estin hamartia. Now you don't have to have the article here, right? That's the heart of man. It could be anthropu to anthropu. Sometimes the article can make something generic, so it could be man in general. That is certainly an option. Oh, and I said tuthau here of the Lord. It should be tu kuriu. My bad, folks. Tu kuriu. All right. Now we have 4 here. Heaven and earth are the glory of Jesus. We have this particular construction, hauranas kai he ge asin he doxa tu theu, right? And in many cases, you're just kind of trying to reproduce the logic you're seeing here down here. And I would strongly recommend that you consult the answer key if you get stuck on these things. This can be one of the more taxing tasks that you perform. And the sign of the kingdom of God is the gospel. Let's see. Ta semean tes basileas tu theu estin ta un gelion, right? You can probably see that in your textbook, and the answer key will have some information there. Some of this is pretty straightforward. It's just more challenging. Plummer does say don't worry about the accents, but do worry about breathing marks. And I'll reiterate, breathing marks are part of the spelling of the word, especially, rough breathing marks in particular. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. But otherwise, God bless you, and I look forward to seeing you on Saturday.